Hi, and welcome to our video for teaching and learning theory. Our video will be discussing behavioral learning theory, a historical perspective and practical application. Our team consists of Ryan Boggs, Brian Gatsky, Justin Schinkel, and Dane Bartz. This screen recording was developed for our learning theory assignment at the Rocky Mountain University of Health Professions. This YouTube video will provide a quick explanation of behavioral learning theory.
Hello Jenny, can I explain any psychology concepts?
Professor Siegfried, what is behaviorism?
Well Jenny, the primary principle of behaviorism, as expressed in the writings of John B. Watson and B. F. Skinner, and others, is that psychology should concern itself with the observable behavior of people and animals, not with unobservable events that take place in their minds. The behaviorist school of thought maintains that behaviors as such can be described scientifically without recourse either to internal physiological events or to hypothetical constructs such as thoughts and beliefs.
Thanks, Professor, for explaining behaviorism.
Behaviorists believe that learning is a change in observable behavior, and it happens when the communication occurs between the two events, a stimulus and a response. Behavioral learning theory, also known as behaviorism, is concerned with the observable behavior acquired through conditioning. There are two types of conditioning, operant and classical conditioning. Operant conditioning was first described by B. F. Skinner, an American psychologist, which involves applying reinforcement or punishment after a behavior, focuses on strengthening or weakening voluntary behaviors. Classical conditioning, first described by Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist, involves placing a neutral signal before a reflex, focuses on involuntary automatic behaviors. In the early 1900s, Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist, was studying salivation in dogs when he noticed that the dogs would begin to drool when he entered the room. He showed the existence of the unconditioned response, the food, by presenting a dog with a bowl of food and measuring its salivary secretion. However, he later discovered that any object would trigger the same response if the dogs associated the object with food. This acted as the foundation of behaviorism, as the dog learned to do something based on a stimulus. Eventually, at one point, the dogs did not respond with salivation, so their behavior had changed. He concluded that a change in the behavior of this type must be a result of learning. John Watson was an American psychologist who formally established behaviorism as a theory. Influenced by the early work of Pavlov, Watson published a manifesto in 1913 titled Psychology as a Behaviorist Views It. In this paper, he reasoned that all human behavior is based on conditioning from the environment around us. He is best known for suggesting that consciousness does not explain our behaviors, rather, external reactions to our actions shape what we do and how we think. This theory suggests that we are passive organisms that only respond to the stimulus that is presented to us. One of the most well-known studies on conditioning is the Little Albert experiment, conducted by Watson and Rayner in the 1920s. This was the first study that examined the concepts established by Pavlov and Watson in a human model. Little Albert was a 9-month-old infant who was tested on his reactions to various stimuli. He was shown a white rat, a rabbit, monkey, and various masks. Albert, described as on the whole stolid and unemotional, showed no fear of any of these stimuli. However, what did startle him was that caused him to be afraid was a hammer that was struck against a steel bar behind him. The sudden loud noise would cause little Albert to burst into tears. 2 months later, when he was just over 11 months old, the white rat was presented, and seconds later, a hammer was struck against the steel bar again. This was done 7 times over the next 7 weeks, and each time, little Albert burst into tears. Now, he only had to see the rat and immediately showed every sign of fear. He would cry, whether or not the hammer was actually hit against the steel bar. He would attempt to crawl away. In addition, Watson and Rayner found that Albert developed phobias of objects which shared characteristics with the rat, including family dog, fur coats, some common cotton wool, and a Father Christmas mask. This process is known as generalization. Watson and Rayner had shown that classical conditioning could be used to create a phobia. A phobia is an irrational fear. An example, a fear that is out of proportion to the danger. Over the next few weeks and months, little Albert was observed, and 10 days after conditioning, his fear of the rat was not as pronounced. This dying out of a learned response is called extinction. Edwin Guthrie expanded on the works previously done with contiguous conditioning. His theory is simply explained as a stimulus creates a movement and collection of movements become the action. Repetitive stimulus in times develops an associative response or action. These responses can become habits if repeated frequently. Cueing habit formation for an educator through Guthrie's methods comes down to three main methods. The first method of habit formation is threshold. This is using the stimulus in small increments to start increasing the stimulus that is unwanted response is decreased. An example of this method would be at the beginning of school semester when students' attention span is short. Therefore, the teacher could start education sessions in short periods of time followed by a break. Overall, a period of several days, these sessions become longer as students are conditioned to the stimulus. The use of active learning strategies fits the threshold model as well, as the breaks in lectures can be spent in a student-involved learning activity. The second method is the fatigue method. The fatigue method of habit forming is more applicable to preparing students to learn. This method is used when an unwanted stimulus is performed by a student and to help them overcome the desire to perform the act. They are asked to perform the activity repeatedly until it is no longer fun and desirable. For an example, Billy likes to make paper airplanes and throw them in class. This disrupts the classroom and the teacher needs to remove this behavior from the class. In action, the teacher removes Billy from the classroom, provides him with a giant stack of paper, and tells Billy to make paper airplanes over and over until Billy no longer likes to make paper airplanes. Another example of this would be to allow students to be active, induce fatigue, so that while they are tired and recovering, they will be more receptive to learning. The final method is incompatible response. This is done by combining a cue for the undesired behavior with a response that is incompatible with the undesired response. An example of this would be to utilize an activity that requires the use of a student's hands to keep them from roughhousing. B.F. Skinner was a prominent behaviorist in the 1930s and 1940s. Skinner is widely regarded as the father of operant conditioning. His views of the behaviorist theory were much less extreme than those proposed by Watson and accepted that genetics may have some role with behavior. He also suggested that association principle in classical conditioning was too simple to explain human behavior. He proposed a cause and effect which suggests previous response and actions result in different reactions and behavior patterns. This is often referred to as operant conditioning. Behavior which is reinforced tends to be repeated. Behavior which is not reinforced tends to be extinguished. Skinner has stated a powerful message in a variety of his publications by saying behaviorism holds practical importance, specifically empowers in altering behavior enough to be socially important, which is essential for life. For an example, suppose we had a mouse in a cage with a lever that is hooked up to a mechanism that dispenses food. When the mouse presses the lever, it gets food. Eventually, the mouse will press the lever. The mouse may or may not connect the appearance of food that is pressing with the lever, but after a few similar occurrences, it will. The mouse will associate the pressing with the lever and food, and will press it down when it wants to get food. So the presentation of food was acted as a positive reinforcement for the behavior of pressing the lever. Now we suppose we can change the mechanism so that when it comes to pressing the lever, instead of receiving a food pellet, it is given electrical shock to its paw. Very quickly, the mouse will stop pressing the lever. Electrical shock has acted as a punishment, which has had the effect of weakening the action of the mouse pressing the lever. This is punishment. Lastly, we set up the cage so that the floor can be electrified and alter the mechanism so that when the lever switches off the current, once we electrify the floor of the cage, the mouse will stop or start bouncing around and will probably accidentally hit the lever. This will turn off the electrical current. Eventually, the mouse will learn to press the lever immediately when the current is turned on. We have reestablished and strengthened the lever pressing behavior, so we must have been reinforcing it. However, this was not a positive reinforcement, as we are not rewarding the rat with something it liked. Rather, we are reinforcing it by taking away something it didn't like. This is an example of negative reinforcement. Although they can be very similar by definition, it's important to consider the unique differences between reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement means that you are enforcing the behavior to keep happening in the future. Punishment means that you are enforcing the behavior to not happen in the future. For an example of punishment, in our current classroom setting, when the teacher takes away your phone or mobile device and asks the student to leave because the student keeps playing on it while they're in the classroom. In our next slide, you will see a YouTube video that will show an example of positive and negative reinforcement with a toddler.
Okay. No, thank you. We don't play with the remote. Okay. Here. You can play with the remote then. All right, what just happened was an example of positive and negative reinforcement. Kyan really wanted the remote, and I really wanted him to stop crying. So by giving him the remote, he was positively reinforced, and he's more likely to start crying the next time he wants the remote control. In this situation, I was negatively reinforced because by giving him the remote control, I got to stop his crying.
As shown in that video, the baby was the positive reinforcement and the woman was the negative reinforcement. As you see on the current slide, the flowchart of operant conditioning. Notice the breakdown of reinforcement and punishment. The reinforcement branch is where we will focus, as it has been shown to be more effective than punishment in the learning environment. Adding punitive measures in the classroom creates a negative learning environment. It does not foster relational aspects that help promote change in students' mindset. As we know, mindset is a huge component to our success within learning. Utilizing both forms of reinforcement will have a positive impact on learning. If you are trying to have students adapt to a 21st century classroom and integrate technology usage, using a reinforcement strategy is potentially helpful. Students can utilize technology to take polls, investigate information, and communicate with the classmates. Enforcing staying on task will direct comments and observations will help to foster a positive learning environment. Continuous. Imagine a situation where a student who refused to complete math problems received a piece of candy every time she completed one math problem accurately. It is likely that she will quickly make the connection between math problems and the candy and would likely to complete many math problems quickly to receive that candy. The developmental aspect of math problem completion is known as behavioral acquisition. The student is acquiring the behavior rapidly because she is being rewarded for every behavioral occurrence. The technical term for this schedule is continuous reinforcement schedule. Ratio. When teaching a skill, you can provide feedback on a schedule. Every instant of correct movement is not needed to be reinforced. The feedback can be provided every third correct repetition. This allows for the person practicing not to be overloaded by the feedback. Interval. The variable situation example would be a pop quiz on the material the student should have prepared for that day, whereas fixed reinforcement schedule providing feedback for a term paper if it is completed by the deadline. This fixed approach allows for the procrastination in student learning, which is not desirable. The variable approach can be used, but students must be fully aware of the conditions so they are prepared adequately. In the classroom, we seek to change and influence behaviors for a positive learning outcome. The use of conditioning principles and reinforcement are suggested to be used on a variable basis to have the largest impact on student learning. Punishment is a method that can be used sparingly in the classroom. Take a second and pause the presentation. Look over the definitions for parental involvement, high expectations, self-evaluation, and so on. This slide provides a quick summary of all the information discussed moments ago. Check for learning. Let's also pause on this slide. I want you to develop 2 behaviors that would be experienced in the classroom. After you develop those 2 behaviors that may be experienced, now I want you to develop 2 reinforcements for those behaviors. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you learned something about behaviorism and learning theories and how they can be applied in your classroom.